So with that said, let's get into our presentation today on SharePoint administration. So what we're going to cover is an overview of what SharePoint is, where it's come from, what it's all about, and then we're going to look at the different components that we need to manage typically within SharePoint. So that's site collections, sites, subsites, and then permissions. Beyond that, we'll cover some best practices and finish up with some takeaways. So let's dive into a quick overview of what SharePoint is all about. So what you need to appreciate is that SharePoint has been with us since before the year 2000. We typically see it surface today in two different versions. One is the Foundation version, the other one being the Enterprise version. So many people are probably familiar with the Windows SharePoint services or the team services that was part of SBS 2008 and prior. So that was obviously the free version, and then there's always been a commercial paid version. Now these days SharePoint also includes the ability to connect to an Office Online server that gives you the ability to edit and modify, view Office documents online, so Office documents in a browser. That needs to generally take place in an additional server in the SharePoint farm. Now, SharePoint is a technology that is dependent on a number of other technologies, so it's built on top of IIS. So it needs a web server to render the pages, to be able to create the active pages, to handle all that sort of information and the interaction between the users. At the back end, it is storing its information in an SQL database. So no matter where SharePoint is installed, you will find an SQL database. So even in the Foundation version, even on Small Business Server, you would find a version of SQL Express, a free version of SQL Express. So as data files and usage has increased, more and more has there been a need to store information in SQL, and some of the basic versions of SharePoint, the Foundation versions, have had database limitations upon them. So typically we see things like a 10 gigabyte database limit on those versions in SBS. You can get beyond that by using the full version of or a commercial version of SQL, but obviously that requires a commercial or enterprise license. You also need a Windows server, so IIS SQL are typically also running on a Windows server, but you'll need to install the SharePoint binaries on a Windows server. So as you can see, there are a number of dependencies that are required to actually get SharePoint up and running. So a typical way that SharePoint is configured, it is configured in what's known as a farm. Now that farm includes a front-end web server to handle all the requests from the users. It then has a back-end database where all the information, the files and the appointments and the calendars, all that information is stored in SQL. You then need an indexing server. So one of the benefits SharePoint provides is that all the information installed or copied into SharePoint is indexed constantly. So it's always being indexed, so that needs to go on its own server to basically spread the workload. And typically, as I said, you need to have an Office Online server to be able to view and edit documents in a browser. Now, given the growth and the usage of SharePoint increasing, this means that we typically now have to cluster the front-end web server, and we now have to cluster the database server as well. So we're looking at potentially best practice around at least 6 servers to actually replicate a good, decent SharePoint environment on premises. Now the good thing is that Office 365 takes all that hardware worry and requirement away from us, and basically provides us with SharePoint Enterprise server. Okay, so this version that you get is not the Foundation version, it is the full Enterprise server. You also get Office Online, so you don't have to worry about configuring an additional Office Online server. All the abilities to edit documents in a browser is provided with Office 365. You also get add-ons which you don't necessarily get with the on-premises equivalent. So you will get access to Yammer, you'll get access to Power BI, you'll get access to Delve, and the features do depend on what plan you go for. So there are a number of different SharePoint Online plans that are available, but at its core, it is SharePoint Enterprise Server and includes Office Online as well. So the essentials about SharePoint Online are that there are two plans, basically. SharePoint Online Plan 1. So Online Plan 1 gives you all the basic stuff. It gives you document libraries, calendars, contacts, tasks, subsites, and also a OneDrive for Business. The SharePoint Online Plan 2 will give you all the features of SharePoint Online Plan 1, but includes advanced features like Excel services, Access services, info path services, e-discovery, and so on. So different SharePoint Online plans are included in different suites. They can also be purchased as standalone offerings. Both plans include Office Online. So if you have a customer that needs, for example, the ability to create forms that would need an info path service, then you need to look at SharePoint Online Plan 2. The business plans, the business suites, typically include SharePoint Online Plan 1, where to get SharePoint Online Plan 2, you'll need to look at a minimum of E3 or E4. Okay, so there are some limitations when it comes to the storage capacity in Office 365. So all plans provide you with, at the moment, 10 gigs of pooled storage plus half a gig per user. So if you have 10 licensed users, 10 licensed SharePoint users, you will have an extra 5 gigabytes of pooled storage to allocate amongst your team sites. Microsoft has committed to raising this initial 10 gig starting point to 1 terabyte in the very near future. So this means that team sites will automatically upgrade to a pooled storage that will start at 10 gigabytes. You also receive 1 terabyte of OneDrive for Business per licensed user. So every licensed user has access to their own OneDrive for Business, which is based on SharePoint technology. That is also being increased to effectively unlimited space. So that now means that users can store up to as much information as they want in their own personal OneDrive for Business. You can purchase additional storage for your team sites to go into the pooled storage. The price on that is relatively cheap and will simply be added to the storage. So if you need more than the 10 gigabyte limit available today, can't wait for the upgrade to the 1 terabyte, you can certainly go out and purchase that additional storage as you would purchase any existing license in Office 365. And when that does upgrade to the 1 terabyte, the storage you have purchased will simply be added to what you already have available. You can't purchase additional storage for OneDrive for Business. So the only additional storage you can purchase is for team sites. There is a 1 terabyte maximum per site collection. So basically the maximum amount of space you can allocate to one web area or one URL in SharePoint is 1 terabyte at this point in time. So if you have information that exceeds that 1 terabyte, you would need to break it up into separate site collections. So with that, let's dive in and start talking about our SharePoint site collection. So a site collection is the very top container when we start talking about SharePoint. A site collection is simply a container for a number of SharePoint sites. Okay, so think of the site collection obviously as a collection of SharePoint sites. You can also think of it as a security boundary. So at this point, you can use that to determine which users have access to this collection of information inside it. So in many cases, you may want to set up a site collection for just internal users. You may want to set up a second site collection for internal and external users to collaborate on. So basically like an extranet style project. So think of it again, a site collection as a potential security boundary. It's also a container for third-party apps. So you may not be aware that you can add third-party applications from the Office 365 store into a SharePoint site collection. So maybe you found a good third-party timesheet app that is part of Office 365 Store. You can add that into a site collection. So maybe you want to add it into a certain area and not into another. So again, think of it as a container in which you can put third-party applications to be used within that collection of websites. It's also a container for certain features that you enable in SharePoint. So you can enable a certain web publishing, for example, option, and that will then be enabled across all of the sites in this site collection. So again, maybe you want to set up a relatively simple site collection and not enable a lot of features, just to keep things as simple as possible for users. However, you may also wish to have something that's far more complex that may have a full enterprise publishing or complete document management. You can do that in a secondary or a second site collection and only have that feature apply within that area. So again, think of it as a container to control which features are enabled in that area. In Office 365, you're going to start with a few default site collections, but you can always add more. So typically, most people will see that they will have a single team site available to them. They then typically also have a shared site and a few others which we'll cover shortly. But you can certainly go in and add a second and more site collections if you want. So a very good example is that best practice is to ensure that your internal team site is separated from any external site in which you share information. In that case, you would then go in and set up a second site collection in which you would then invite or allow external parties who aren't licensed in Office 365 but can still access Office 365 thanks to the free licenses that are available, and therefore you get a separation between your internal and your external information. So that's a best practice or a reason you may go in and create a second site collection. If you have an older Office 365 tenant, you may also see what's called an external site collection. So initially when Office 365 was released, there was the ability to create what was known as an external SharePoint site. This was typically aimed at being used as a public website, but Microsoft, after looking at the metrics, found that basically this feature wasn't being used, so it has now deprecated that from new tenants. Like I said, just excuse me while I take a break to cover up for the cold here. And what that means is if you have a customer who has an existing site, they may already have an external website. Microsoft has committed basically to maintaining those for a period probably now of about 18 months. But if you do have a client that is currently using an external SharePoint site as a website, then you probably need to make sure they are migrated onto another option as soon as possible. So new tenants, you will not see the external website, but the older ones you may. And typically, remember, team sites are for where you'll find the site collection. So each time you create a site collection, this is for a team site. A team site is designed for access by a group of users, not to be restricted to a single user. So it's where groups of users come together to share information, documents, calendars, and contacts. So the way that we administer SharePoint in general is that you do it in a number of layers. So you would have the farm administrator. So the farm administrator's responsibility was around adding servers, the web front end, the database back end, doing all that sort of infrastructure style configuration. Next, under that, you had the central administration. So the central administration was then how you would set up the web applications, the websites, the URLs, the encrypted SSL if you needed to do that. That sort of stuff was done at that central admin level. And then we get into the tenant admin level where you can then manage site collections. Now, as you can see from the graphic, Microsoft is handling the farm administration and the central admin, and all you basically able to access now is the tenant admin. Now, this is really good because the administration of SharePoint, especially at the farm and the central administration, is quite a complex job, and it makes a lot of sense that Microsoft are the best ones to manage that, make sure it's load balanced, make sure that it's optimized and performing for the environment. So again, the less admin, the less work that you have to do to worry about infrastructure, the better off it is. So in essence, this is how a SharePoint environment is structured. As I mentioned, we have at the top level, we have our site collection. Now within our site collection, we have a root site. So we basically have a primary site in which that is the top of our tree, I suppose, or the base of our tree. And inside that site, we can create a number of apps. So those apps could be, for example, a document library, a calendar, contacts, lists, tasks, or whatever. Inside those individual apps are items. So the individual items inside our document library are obviously documents. Inside our calendars, they're calendar appointments and entries. Contacts are our individual contacts. Now, not only can we create apps, we can also go into a site and create a sub-site. So basically, it's just replicating the ability of the site, and it's beginning to create a hierarchical structure. So once we create a sub-site, we've then got the option to create further apps, further sub-sites, and further items within that. So again, you can see hopefully that a SharePoint structure is very much like a file system. Okay, so not only can it handle files, but it can also handle calendar, contacts, and other collaboration items. But basically, you can create a tree-like structure in which you can continue to build a structure that makes the most sense for the organization. So with that, let me jump out to a desktop here and give you a bit of an idea here of what this will look like. Okay, so I'll give that a minute to display here. So hopefully you should see a Windows 10 desktop appear on the screen here. So hopefully that's all good for you now. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my Edge. I'm going to go to Office 365. And you'll see that thanks to Windows 10 and Azure AD Join, I'm logged straight into Office 365 with my credentials. I go to my admin area, and then my Office 365 admin area, I scroll down the left-hand side here, and under the admin area, you'll see that I have an option here for SharePoint. Now this will take me to the SharePoint Admin Center. So this is the very top level administration of SharePoint in Office 365. Now on the right hand side here, you'll see all the different different site collections I have. So this is the default one here, which is the tenant name .sharepoint.com. Another default one here is the tenant name.sharepoint.com/search. Okay, so I've also set up an e-discovery center. The my.sharepoint.com is typically where the SkyDrive for Business, the OneDrive for Business information lives. Now, if I want to go in and configure any of these settings for an existing site collection, I simply select that site collection, and then you'll see I go up here and select the properties option. This will tell me how many subsites that I have, who is the overall administrator, the storage, and the quota. So the quota is how much storage it can be maxed out to. You'll see that I also have the ability to go here and set up the owners, the administrators. In here you'll see that we have the ability, or you have the ability to nominate a single primary site collection administrator. So a site collection administrator is the super user of SharePoint, that site collection. So once you make someone a site collection administrator, they will have full rights through the whole structure of that site collection, and those rights will not be visible to anybody within that site collection. The only way you'll be able to see that is coming into the admin area here. You can only set one primary site collection administrator, but you can, however, go in and set as many secondary site collection administrators as you need. Okay, so if you go in here and basically need to take control of a complete SharePoint site collection, you go in and make yourself, or make the user, a primary or a secondary site administrator. you'll see that the other option here that I've got is around sharing. Now this is an important concept to understand because this allows us to determine who has or who can have access to this site. So at the moment this site collection is set up so that not only can it be shared with people outside my organization with an email address, but I can also it also allows users to share information, so files and sites, with others outside the organization by simply sending them a link. Okay, so you can set the option to not allow anybody to share outside your organization. You can set the second option so that users can share information outside the organization, but when they share it with someone outside, those users need to use a login and a password, and that's typically a free Microsoft account. Or you can allow the most open option, which is people can just send a link, so an anonymous link, and people can just click on that and have full access. So remember to manage that sharing exactly the way that you want, and remember the sharing is set on a per site collection level. Next option here is our storage quota. So this is where we can control how much storage is allocated to our individual site collection. So if you want, you can go in and manually say that, for example, I want to allocate this so much gigabytes and send me an email when it reaches that level. But I'll show you potentially an easier way to manage that. As you can see, you can buy additional resources and you can set server resources. Now, if you decide to go in here and delete the site collection, which is an option here on the menu, it will send it to a recycle bin for 30 days. So if some unknown reason you decide to go in and delete a site collection and then decide you need to recover it, you have 30 days to do that. If you want to create a new site collection, all you do basically is go new and go private site collection. See how that we don't have an option to do an external site collection anymore. So again, we just go in there, fill in the details, give it a name, a URL, a template to start with, and basically away we go. Now the other option you'll probably need to work with here is the settings. So down the bottom on the menu here, towards the bottom is an option here called settings. Now if we go into there, you'll see that we can hide or show the option for OneDrive for Business and Sites. Okay, so we can make that unavailable to users. This option here allows you to set the site collection storage to automatic. So what that means is that rather than you having to go in to manually adjust the storage as required as the sites get used more and more, you can let SharePoint manage that. So as the storage is required by each site collection, SharePoint will automatically allocate the minimum that's required out of the pool for you, up to obviously the limit of storage that you have. We've now got the ability to control the OneDrive for Business experience. There is a new experience that's being rolled out, very much like the consumer version. You can turn that option off for all users here. Again, you have the option to simplify the admin center if you want. The ability to turn off Office Graph. So if you turn off Office Graph, you basically disable Delve. Okay, and we can control the enterprise social network. So SharePoint did come with its own inbuilt social network, but Yammer has certainly replaced that. So certainly recommend you upgrade and use Yammer to do that. And you'll see that there are a number of other options that you can go in here and set up and configure basically as you require. So again, you'll find that in the settings option in the site collection admin area. All right, so let's just swap back to the slides. Okay, having trouble trying to get it to present. Okay, so let's try again. Try and get this to come up. Okay, so let's flick back to the beginning. So please bear with me while we go through and find where we ended off. Okay, so hopefully that's where we were. Okay, so let's now look at some basics around permissions. Now, the permissions are handled very much like files. Okay, so basically you can assign permissions to just about anything in SharePoint from the site collection level all the way down to an individual item. So again, think of it like files and folders. You can assign rights to someone to give them access to a server. You can give them rights to a network share. You can give them rights to a folder within a network share, or you can give them rights to an individual item within a network share. Now, again, best practice is you want to use the minimum rights to achieve the job. So again, you can, if you want, basically assign users individual rights on individual items. But again, best practice is that you manage it like you manage the items in your file system. You typically would create groups, security groups, in which you would then place your users. And then you would place those security groups into the relevant areas within SharePoint so that they are then assigned those rights. That then means that you never need to return to SharePoint to modify those permissions, because once the permissions are set via the groups, then all you need to do is add users in and out of those security groups, and they will automatically be assigned the rights in SharePoint. So once again, manage SharePoint like you manage a file system. Use the security groups to do it. Create the security groups, add the security groups to SharePoint, and then you'll never need to basically go in and fiddle with those securities in SharePoint again. And one of the advantages that SharePoint 2013 has now provided over previous version is a much simpler shared with method when assigning permissions. So when you initially go to set permissions, what you'll find is that you'll get the basic experience. It'll just ask for the user's email address or name, and then it will then share the information out. Now you can go into the advanced options and drill into it and get access to the low-level SharePoint. We'll cover that. And again, remember that you can share information with anybody who has an email. So provided you have the external sharing rights enabled, which I did show previously, if you just type in their email address, they will receive an email with notification that the information is being shared with them. Then they simply click on that link, and if they are required, they would have to then create a free Microsoft login to allow them access to that. If the permissions aren't that restrictive and they click on it, they may be able to go straight into the site because they've been set up to share anonymously. But always best practice to at least require a login, I would suggest. Now, another important thing to remember here is, just like a file system, by default, out of the box, that everything in SharePoint inherits permissions through the structure. If you make no changes to anything in SharePoint, don't change any of the permissions, the rights set at the top of the tree will automatically apply all the way down through the tree. If you make a change to permissions at the top of the tree, then that change will then flow through the whole structure of your SharePoint by default. So be very aware of that. Also beware that again, that you can certainly change permissions and break permissions and create them as unique, but remember the default is always to inherit from the parent. Okay, so at the site collection level, you can set a single primary site collection administrator, as we talked about. You can have as many secondary site collections. Now remember that a primary and secondary site administrator have the same. They have full, effectively global rights through SharePoint all the way through the structure, and those rights are not surfaced or viewable by any other member within the SharePoint site collection. Again, that's what I just said. And again, no matter what rights are changed within the actual site, the site collection administrator retains full rights. So if you need to take full control of the SharePoint site, or a user needs to take full control, the quickest way to do that is to make them a site collection administrator. Now, it's also, as I mentioned, the location to assign rights for external users, right? So if you want to give users who are non-Office 365 users access to the information, maybe you're creating an external collaboration team to work on a project, you would do that, like I said, like I showed you, in the ability by opening the external permissions. All right, so we did sort of look at that, so I'm going to keep going through that. So basically, we now get into the site and the sub-site level permissions. So we're now basically into our site collection. We're at our primary site location. Okay, remember that it's inheriting by default, and the inheritance can be broken once it has all been set up, and then you can go in and assign individual rights. Again, we can set up to share with external users. And when you do, users will receive contribute rights by default. Okay, so if you share with external users, the default option that it will take is they can read, write, and delete. So beware of that, right? So sharing with external users, they will by default typically get read, write, and delete rights out of the box. So if you don't want them to have that, make sure that you set that to read only. Okay. Now, once you've done the site or that, you can also go in and set it at the app level. So you can go in and set it at the individual document library. Okay, so we can go in and set maybe a site is set so everybody can access it, but maybe you want a document library within that site to have unique permissions. It will by default inherit things, but you can go in and you can break these and change these after the fact to configure them the way that you want. And again, the same thing applies with individual items within the app. So an individual document within a document library, you can control the rights that a user has, but remember by default it inherits those rights. Okay, so again, don't forget those items, if set to share, will be available to be shared by default from to any external users. Okay. Okay, so let's have a look now at doing that. So let's go back to our desktop. Give that a second to update for you. Okay, so you should now see that I've gone to the sites area in my Office 365. You'll see that I have a single team site. I can create more team sites, and if I want to, I can select the Manage Promoted Site. So this is known as a Managed Promoted Site. The sites that I'm following here is customizable by the individual user. The top area here is set by an administrator. Now, if I go to my team site, remember I'm inside a site collection. This is now the first site or the root site inside my site collection. Now, if I want to share this whole site from this point down, I simply go to the share button in the top right, and you'll see I get this simplified interface I talked about. So all I need to do here is go in and type a user's name in my tenant, and it should self-resolve for me. I select the user. I can put in an email address of a random person on the internet, provided that I have basically given the ability to share with external people. You'll notice that I do get a warning saying that a@a.com is outside my organization. As I pointed out, remember that this user here can now, you are now giving them edit permissions, which you may not want to do. So you can put in a personal message here. Please review. Okay, and don't forget there are options down here, and I can choose whether to send an email invitation or not send an email invitation, but typically you want to send them an email invitation to let them know that's happening. Now, what I can do is I can now see by going to the shared with who already has access to this. So you'll see that by default, because this is my first team site, everyone except external users has access to this. Now, if I want to get into the low-level granular permissions here, I go into the advanced option, and this is the traditional SharePoint options here. Now, I can go in here and grant permissions, right? Add more people in here. I could create a new SharePoint group. Okay, so this is where I would go in and create a SharePoint group in which I could then add Office 365 security groups. I could go in here and say, you know what, I don't want to have my Excel services viewers accessing that. I can remove their permissions from this area. Okay, so there I go. And I may go in here and say, you know what, team members, I want to edit their permissions so that perhaps I don't want them to edit, I just want them to contribute. Okay, so I can go in and change their individual accesses, save that. Okay, and you'll see now that they are set to contribute. I can check the permissions, so I can go in here and I can put in a user. Okay, so if I put in a user here, right, I can now verify what rights that user has at exactly that point. Okay, so it's getting rights through it's getting contribute rights from being a member of team site members. Okay, so again, you'll see that we can do that at the site level. Now, if I go into a document library here, and I go into library, go into library settings, you'll see there is an option here called permissions for this document library. Again, looks very similar to what we just saw, and you'll see here you get the notification here that this library is inheriting permissions from its parent, which it does by default. To stop that, I just stop inheriting permissions. I go yes, okay. It'll then make them unique permissions, and I could go in here, for example, and say, you know what, I don't want my team visitors to have access to this area at all, and I could add more users and do whatever I want. Now, if I make a mistake, I could certainly go in here and delete the unique permissions and re-inherit from the top. So if I delete these, this will put it back to inheriting the permissions for me. Likewise, if I go into the document library and I go into an individual document here, okay, so if I go into an individual document and I, for example, go into the share option, as I always do, go into shared with, then go into advanced, I'm actually looking at the individual item here. Again, you'll see it's inherited. This document has unique permissions in this case, right? So I can delete the unique permissions. Okay, and if I want, again, stop the unique permissions, stop inheriting, create new permissions, and go in here. Okay, maybe I don't want them to have this. Sorry, if you don't want these, remove these user permissions, and maybe I want to add in a specific user for some reason. So if I put in Lewis Collins in here, maybe again, and go OK. Alright, so I can do that. But you'll also notice here that when I go in here to grant permissions, you'll see that I have the ability to get a link. So this is the anonymous connection that I was talking about. So you can go in here and allow potentially users just to click on a link to view and access the information. So again, in summary, what we've got here is when we go to our sites, we can, for example, set the permission at the site level, right? So this is the top of our tree. By going to share, we can go into an individual app and set the permissions there, which we do typically by going into library settings and then go into permissions. And if we want, we can do the same and go into each individual item like we can in a file system. So let me just swap back to the slides. Okay, so basically, as you hopefully can appreciate, it's very similar to file-based systems. You can assign them most things right down to the individual line item. You probably don't want to do that. Again, it's best to, again, keep it as simple as possible. Use the groups to do it is a much better option to achieve that. Okay, so again, Office 365 has that ability to provide that via the simplified share option. Okay, and you can share via an email address here. Okay, so we've jumped. Okay, so I've jumped back a couple of slides here again. So let me find out where we ended up. Okay. Okay, so let's finish off with some best practices here. So again, it's very important to understand how the structure of SharePoint works with site collections, sites, subsites, apps, items, and individual entities, so you can get the best results. Okay, so again, typically it means breaking and putting it into specific areas. Again, there are plenty of ways to store information in sites, subsites, and individual apps, so use all the areas that are available to you, because that's how you get optimal performance. And again, don't forget that by default, SharePoint's going to inherit those permissions by default. Okay, so it's going to flow all the way down the tree, so it's very easy to make permission oversights, so be very careful with that. And again, try and manage your permissions at your highest level. Either do it at the site, do it at the app, try and avoid doing it at the individual item within the app. Right, so it's very difficult, as with a file system, to manage permissions on an item-by-item level. So again, SharePoint is like a tool. It's like any Office application. You only get out of it what you put into it. It requires some building, some thought, some planning, and that's the job generally of a reseller, to be able to advise the client and assist them in that process. SharePoint is a central part of Office 365. It surfaces things like the team sites, OneDrive for Business, Project Online, CRM Online, all that sort of stuff is basically being pushed out through SharePoint. Therefore, the files and folders, the way that storage is managed in Office 365 is done in SharePoint. That means that resellers really need to have knowledge around SharePoint because it's such a critical and central part of Office 365. So if you don't know SharePoint, do spend some time getting up to speed on what it can do. And remember, it's more than just files and folders. It's not just a pure file-based storage location. It is good for calendars, contacts, task lists, all sorts of stuff. And it typically means a change in thinking. Okay, so we're moving from pure storage to collaboration. Okay, so this means that many businesses may have to rethink or redesign or modify the way that they go about their business processes. There certainly will be benefit, but it's a matter of mapping that to the business requirements. So SharePoint is a different way. It's not files and folders. It's not an F drive. It's not an M drive. It is a different way of working, and it brings a lot of information together in one central location, whereas before you would have attachments on file servers or in emails, and then you have calendar somewhere else. So again, it brings all that information into one central location. And as always, the best way to manage things is to keep them as simple as possible, especially where it comes to permissions. So some resources I can give you there. The top one that I'll point you to is a free 23-part SharePoint email course I have developed that you can sign up for. So it's bit.ly/gs-spo, more aimed at end users. But if you've never used SharePoint, I think that's a good place to start. You'll get a lesson every day, plus which includes a video and some course notes. So hopefully that'll lift your SharePoint knowledge and help you with Office 365 management.